Good evening and welcome to the Tenement Museum. My name is Annie Polland. I'm the museum's president, and I'm so excited to be here in the Levine apartment with Letty Cottin Pogrebin to talk about her latest book, Shanda. She is the author of 12 books, but who's counting? And I have been following her career for over 40 years. When I was little, my sister and I in Milwaukee, Wisconsin would go to the Shorewood Public Library, and we would order Free to Be You and Me and sit down, and the librarian would bring us the headsets to listen to, and we would sing along and have to be reminded by said librarian over and over again not to sing out loud at the Shorewood Public Library. But this was Free to Be You and Me, which you worked on.
Yes.
And had such a wonderful feminist message and such a wonderful, messages, unfortunately, that we still need today.
Like mommies and daddies are people. Parents are people.
People with
or
children.
It's all right to cry. Or glad to have a friend like you.
I want to sing all the songs now. You're going to get me in trouble. That librarian in Shorewood is watching it and just going to...
Whenever I walk down the street with Marlo, fully grown human beings start singing out their child voices on the street.
And you also co-founded Ms. Magazine, and again wrote many books, including Deborah, Golda, and Me, with some of the material you revisit in this book tonight, and have been on the boards of many wonderful organizations. But I want to dive into this book, and before I do, I want to explain a little bit why we're doing this book talk in this apartment. This is the recreated apartment of the Levine family. Harris and Jenny Levine came in 1892 from Polland, now part of Poland, then part of the Russian Empire, and set up a garment factory in this apartment and raised 5 kids. And every day we tell their story. And we focus more and more, we've been focusing on Jenny's perspective, thinking about what it was like for a tenement housewife who, in the census record, it's left blank. Occupation is left blank, but obviously did so much for the household economy and for the family. And so I just think reading your book lends insight on this tenement generation, all the stories that don't make it into records like the census, but are just as important as understanding the ages and the numbers of people in the family and everything else. So tell us why, again, you've written before, and you've written about your family before as well, why revisit this material now?
Well, I started writing this memoir to be a conventional chronological memoir. And as I spun out my family memories, I realized every one of them was about a secret. Things that my family were ashamed of range from their poverty, origins, foreign accents, cooking smells. They had to, give up stuffed cabbage and start making mighty fine chocolate pudding to be real Americans. And all these stories that, as they fleshed themselves out, had to do with shame-based secrets of some kind. And as I sort of cogitated a lot on the pattern, I realized that I was really talking about a generation that will never be seen again, of immigrants who were so dedicated to the idea of assimilating, of getting rid of the baggage of the past, and of all their memories of the old country. There was nothing romantic about it, as it is for me now to think back and wonder what their lives were like in a shtetl in Hungary. They wanted to leave that all behind, and they left their secrets behind, some of them.
And at what point did the title, Shanda, occur to you? So you set out to write the memoir first, and then it was...
And then the stories, the anecdotes sort of told me that this was a book about the Shanda, the power of the Shanda, to sort of censor the truth of a person's being, the facts of their life. They had to be in denial. They were busy creating a kind of a charade person who was neater perhaps than they were, was more confident than perhaps they were, because they had to pass themselves off as, I'm making it, I'm going to be a success. And a lot of that had to do with recreating, reinventing the self. My mother was an absolute past master at inventing a kind of image for herself of an educated woman. She graduated from the 8th grade, but she faked her photograph of a high school graduate in order to feel that she was more acceptable.
And I want to go back to that later, but in terms of, I want to make sure we just explain to the audience the word Shanda and what it means.
Shanda means shame or disgrace or scandal. And the power of the Shanda in impacted communities, close-knit Jewish communities, was immeasurable. You could lose your job, you could lose your reputation, you could be ruined, you could be the target of gossip for the rest of your life if a Shanda was revealed about you.
Can you hear in your mind conversations that your relatives had?
Yes.
Can you hear them saying the word Shanda?
I hear the word Shanda accompanied by the word Shah. Shah is kind of Yiddish for shut the hell up. Don't say another word, because it's a Shanda. So, Shah, it's a Shanda, was the phrase. It meant that at the dinner table, which was packed with, my parents were each one of 7, and I am one of 24 cousins on both sides. So when I watch my own grandchildren, who are very close cousins, and it just throws me right back to, 24 kids of all ranging ages. And we would sit at the table, crammed in, half of us on bridge chairs, half of us on little stools, a children's table, a couple of bottles of water, no booze, no wine.
I love you say something about that in the book, about there was no booze, but it was like you chewed on stories as if they were bread.
Right, we did.
And savored the stories.
We did. But you knew when you had crossed the line, when you started telling a story about someone that was not to be, even to the family, not to be articulated in public. The biggest fear was the Shanda for the Goyim. And that is the scandal or the disgrace or the sort of shame-based secret that would be judged badly by non-Jews. So you had to watch yourself in your own family. Then the circle went out. You had to watch yourself in the Jewish community, and then out further to the Gentile world. And that's where you could be really humiliated. If you might remember that my grandfather had a coffee and tea store down here somewhere. I never was able to find the address. And one day his eldest son said, I just got married, my wife is pregnant, leave me the store, give me the store, because you're ready to retire, give me the store. And my grandfather said yes. 2 other brothers rebelled, made a big deal out of how they were cut out. Of course, nobody was looking at the 4 daughters who were also cut out. That was just, beyond the pale.
Only the Russ family did that. The Russ for Russ and daughters. They were the only ones that thought of they had no sons. But that was, but you're absolutely right in terms of business and thinking about who the business could go to. Women were completely disregarded.
Completely shut out. But my Uncle Lou, who got the store, my grandfather said, okay, you can have the store because you're the one who's married, you're the one who has a pregnant wife, and you need to be supported. And he, when his brothers objected, and they tried to get my grandpa to reverse the bequest in his life, he was alive, but to reverse the decision, he went on the radio. There was a radio program.
Your grandfather did?
My uncle
Lou
went on the radio, the Goodwill Hour, it was called. It was as popular as Saturday Night Live in its heyday. And it would always start with, if you have a problem, ask Mr. Alexander for the answer. And it was, people were tuned in. 38 million people listened to this show. And therefore, they had a lot of people come on to tell their stories. And my Uncle Lou, the absolute king of the Shandas, told his story, washed the dirty linen of our family on this old radio show. And he was persona non grata after that in our family.
What year was that?
I think it was in the 30s.
Okay.
In the early 30s. And he was simply banned from, certain family simchas.
Well, especially because it's not like he went on a Yiddish talk show
No,
and
he
talked
didn't.
about it, which would have been bad enough. But to go on,
35 million
yeah.
Americans were hearing the Shanda of the Halpern family.
And how did Mr. Alexander? How did he weigh in?
He weighed in favor of Louis.
Ah, even worse.
You know, even worse, right?
So to rewind a little bit, go to the Tenement era when Nathan and Jenny Halpern come over in the early 1900s
Right.
with several of their children already born.
My grandmother Jenny comes with 4 children that my grandfather left behind, just like his Hester Street.
Yes.
Comes here, he establishes his coffee and tea store, and then sends for them, not himself, the brother sends, which was another Shanda, because my grandfather, when my grandmother landed with the 4 children after, I don't know how long it was, in steerage.
2 weeks, probably.
2 weeks in steerage, my grandfather asked her for a divorce. And this is, I gather, a pretty common story.
Because he had a girlfriend,
He had
right?
a girlfriend. He had been here for 3 years, I gather. When they finally came, my grandma came with the 4 children that were born in the shtetl. Think Fiddler on the Roof. That's that shtetl. According to everything I heard, it was just about the same size as Anatevka. It had dirt floors. It had, a bridge over a river. And they ran a little tiny inn in their cottage. How that was, I had no idea. My grandmother gets here, and my grandfather asks for a divorce. So they were baked in Shandas.
And wasn't there a Shanda even before that?
There was.
I love this Shanda story because I think, and again, there's this sense that, the Shandas only happen on this side of the ocean, but there were Shandas also baked into shtetl life. It wasn't the romanticized one unit, one wonderful family. So tell us about the Shanda.
I always consider my grandma Jenny to be the original sin of Shanda makers, because she was a runaway bride. If you saw, anyone who saw Fiddler knows who Laser Wolf is. He's the old guy that young Seidel was betrothed to, and she was in love with Muddle the tailor, a age-appropriate person, and my grandmother was betrothed to a Laser Wolf type person. The marriage went through, the ceremony went through, but when they were in an inn in Pilipitz, this little Hungarian shtetl, and he went to change into whatever Orthodox men wore the night of their weddings, my grandmother tied together all the sheets and pillowcases, and if there were towels, whatever it was, and jumped out the window and ran away.
Amazing.
To my grandfather Nathan, who eventually asked for a divorce when she landed here. It was such a horrible story. It started out so romantic. And I thought I had this, when I found out, I thought I had this incredibly, astonishingly transgressive, rebellious grandma. If only I had known when she was alive.
What had happened?
What happened?
So which Shanda so if we think about the 2 Shandas that framed Nathan and Jenny's lives, the grandparents, and of course the first one was Jenny leaving her betrothed and escaping to Nathan. The second is when she arrives, Nathan having a girlfriend. Which Shanda did you hear about first?
I heard about that both of them at the same time. I think they were linked when my aunt, by mistake, it just came tumbling out of her mouth one day, and I was in my 30s. We were making potato latkes together, and she made a reference to, and what happened in Pilipitz with the first husband, with my mother's first husband. I said, wait a minute. Who are you talking about? My grandma Jenny, the one who stands there with an apron welded to her body, who never says a word except in Yiddish, who's always making, apple strudel and chopped liver and has a fish in the bathtub so she can make gefilte. That woman jumped out of a window to run to her lover? Please, I couldn't even imagine it. And then my aunt told me the whole story. My aunt, the communist.
Okay, we'll get to that.
Another big story.
We'll get to that.
Another big story.
We'll get to that one. So, then the next generation, thinking about your mother, who is the one of the eldest of the.
She was the
She was the eldest,
Mm-hmm.
and I think we have a
She was
photo.
born
from,
in 1901 or 2 or 3 or 4 because she lied
depending
so many
on what.
times.
Yes. So she comes over, and Jenny and Nathan do get back together. So what happens to the? We don't know what happens to the girlfriend.
Yes, we do.
Oh,
yeah, we do. My mother's Uncle Will, the one who actually funded the trip of my grandmother and the 4 children from Philippines to New York City, he forced my grandfather on point of shaming him in the shul, all the ways that you could force a guy to do the right thing in those years. And the deal was my grandfather could continue seeing his paramour as long as he lived with Jenny.
Wow.
And they ended up having 3 more children in a tenement like this.
While he still was seeing the
and
paramour.
He had as far as my aunt knew, he had the paramour for years, and she tolerated it. And my aunt, who told me the story, the second born, she was the second born, said only my mother and she
knew about it.
Because they had to protect. The Shanda would have been that my grandmother was a bigamist. Turns out it's not true because you have to have sexual congress before you can actually authenticate a Jewish wedding. And they never did.
But they had to keep the secret of the girl. They knew about the girlfriend also.
Yeah,
they knew about the second
exactly.
Shonda, and they kept it because they had to keep the whole household running and think
Exactly.
about the younger children and their well-being, and really to think about your grandmother because
she couldn't be shamed in the Jewish world.
Well, and
even
we're
down here in the Lower East Side.
Imagine, and I we're able to bring people into these small tenement apartments, 325 square feet, and say, this is what it was like. This is the crowdedness.
Wow.
But what we're not always able to do is conjure up the feelings of the people in the room, what it was like, and just to know that you're carrying that burden of these secrets in this household.
Yeah,
and
it crunches my heart and my chest to think about. Well, I always feel really, really, really sad for my mother, who was so ashamed of her circumstances and had such aspirations, to rise above her class, that she went so far as to, when she was single, go up to the Bronx and pretend that she was living in Uncle Will's apartment in the North Bronx.
So her dates would think that she was more
and
prosperous.
She would leave her job in a sewing machine factory, get in the subway, go all the way up to the northern reaches of the Bronx, go inside and have her Uncle Will pretend to be her father. So it shamed my grandfather that she was too ashamed to let her dates pick her up.
So the shame kind of keeps doubling
pollinating
back.
itself.
And I think we have a photo of her, and I know that you mentioned it before, but this is a photo of a high school graduation, and that is heartbreaking. And one of the things, too, that we talk about all the time on the tenement tours, when we look at the census materials, we can see that often the older children in a family are working, but the younger children aren't. They're able to stay in school longer precisely because the older children went to work.
Right.
And that many of these older children left school after the 8th grade. It's really not until the 1920s and the 1930s that you have so many Jewish children going to high school and so on and so forth. Which is not to say that there weren't any in the immigrant generation, but it was very much about leaving after 8th grade to work. So when she left 8th grade, she clearly, your mother, Seal, did not want to leave school.
No, my mother really was aspiring to be a whole other person, and felt ashamed that she wasn't educated. She had to leave school at the 8th grade. She went to work as a sewing machine operator. It's so classic, but she faked her graduation photograph, which I gather people are seeing.
Yeah.
She went to the prop box in a photo studio. There were photo studios. There wasn't Photoshop, okay? There were photo studios, and she went into the prop trunk and pulled out a chignon to put on the back of her head to make her look older, long-stemmed silk roses that she had in front of her, and a diploma, most importantly, a rolled-up diploma right out of the prop box. If you had asked my mother, did you graduate from high school, she would not have lied.
Okay.
But if you saw this picture on the side of you know, a bookcase or something, you would assume it's her high school picture, and that's what she wanted. She wanted people to just assume.
And
that,
she did this when she was 13 years old.
exactly. And
I
she
mean,
took money out of her pay in the sewing machine factory, which, what was it, $6 a week? And the photo person, the photo studio person allowed her to pay it on a time basis.
And then when you were growing up in Queens, did she have this photo out?
Yes.
She did.
The photo was out. Other photos were out that were products of her lies, my father's lies. They created like a house of cards, a Potemkin village, whatever you want to call it. It was a complete fiction, their lives. My parents hid the biggest Shanda in their life, which was that they were married before.
Each one had been
Each
married
one had
and
been
divorced.
married before. And to gild that Shanda, even worse, my father had had a daughter, and he abandoned her. My father adopted my mother's daughter. Never told anyone. They just said when they moved from the Bronx to Queens, which is like moving to the
suburbs.
Bahamas or something, so far away. My parents pretended that they were the first marriage of each other, and my father pretended that he was the father of my mother's daughter, and my father's daughter was out of the picture. So you think about disgrace. I mean, to be in the 1920s, to be divorced is disgraceful. My mother had a child, a single woman. There was no such thing as single mother as a category even. She would have been. So she never acknowledged that she had a child.
And she suffered so much because she, to think about her, again, not able to stay in school, still went out to work, still wanted to hide her tenement life. She did marry, but her first husband
was
abusive. And so had the daughter, to protect the daughter, left this husband, but there was no space in that society for her to be open about being a single mother.
That was 1927. I think they were still living down here in 1927.
Okay.
So, I mean, there was a sort of sense of social propriety, even in a place that looked so, relatively culturally primitive. I use the word with scare quotes, but you know what I mean. And yet, to be divorced and to have a child and to be older, who was going to want her? Who was going to want her? So another thing that she hid is she put my sister in boarding school, and that's when she started just putting away money for that. She was always secretly saving money. That was
something
a big
else.
secret.
We often think about immigration as being a rupture, right? So we think about what Jenny and Nathan went through as this rupture coming over and, leaving Europe, leaving the old world and coming to the Lower East Side. But in another sense, I think perhaps just as fundamental was the rupture of leaving or wanting to leave working class life for an American middle class life.
Right.
So like what then happens, your mother's even though she herself was an immigrant, she comes as a child, so she's kind of like in the middle. What were the strains she felt to be American, and that one could argue that it was even more intense psychologically because of all that she was trying to kind of assimilate.
She for an uneducated, for an 8th grade education, for a person who came here when she was 9, who didn't, we have a saying in feminism, if you didn't see it, it's hard to be it. You need some notion of what you could be and could have and could achieve. Somehow she got this dream, and it matched the books that she read.
It's so interesting you say this. I'm thinking to Ruth Abram, who founded this museum and is
And
one of the first quotes of the book, and she
Right.
endorses your book or blurbs for your book. She spoke about growing up in the South, in Atlanta, and not having a woman role model because there were wonderful role models as wives and mothers, but not as, her father was an attorney and quite
A big shot.
a big shot.
knocker.
But she read Jane Addams' book, who had started the settlement houses in the progressive movement, and it was through books that she sees this role that transcends home. And so it's interesting, right? Your mother, who's in Tenements with these roles certain, but she's understanding
She's
there's
reading
another.
Little Women.
Yeah.
My mother developed her ideal family notion straight out of Little Women, and talked about it in the most almost ethereal, idyllic terms. You know, when she became unhappy with my father, she would cite this image of Little Women as the ideal that is not happening to her, and why isn't it happening? And she was divorced from the first one who was abusive, and now my father is very much a peacock, and he was a lawyer, so he had a law school education. She had an 8th grade education. He called her a greenhorn, which is a real put down for an immigrant. And, you know, she was very aware of her circumstances, aware of disappointment happening twice in her marriages, of needing to paper it all over, of not being able to tell anybody about it except her sisters, about how unhappy she was. You had to present to the public. When my mother ended up married to my father, the lawyer, and they lived in the borough of Queens instead of the Lower East Side. I mean, there was again an aspirational step, you know, up. It was lower middle class, and then it really was middle class. So there was a lot to hide.
And when they decided, when they moved from the Bronx to Queens, and they decided that they wouldn't tell the new people they were meeting that they had been married before, and that this was their marriage, and that they had been married for
since 1923,
when
they were actually married since 1937.
To show that Betty, her daughter with Joe Holtzman, was part of one family.
In order to cover that my father was my sister Betty's father.
And I know you don't know the answer to this, but who do you think the audience for The Lie was?
Well, I know because I mean, when I talked to my sister Betty about it, The Lie was told to everybody in a very offhanded way, the way I might say, you know, I've been married for almost 60 years. And she would say, well, I'm married for so-and-so years, you know, whatever it was. But, I mean, you'll remember there's a story in the book about when I was, I think, 9 years old. I insisted that my parents celebrate their 25th wedding anniversary because they were married in 1923, 33, 43, 48. I'm 9 in 48. They're married. I've got it in my head. They're married 25 years. I'm going to make a cake. I'm going to make a fuss. My father says, that's just a number. I do a secret. I send my aunt with my little $10 in my big piggy bank to go and buy
a lot.
It was
for
$10
in 19, yeah.
Believe me, I got a quarter a week. It took a long time. And I also did chores for money. And then I had seen something when I went shopping with my mother, and she was buying an anniversary present for a friend, and she admired, and I loved this little set of cut glass decanter with 4 or 6 tiny glasses, and it was reduced to 10. It's a $9.99. So I told my aunt, here's $10. Go buy Mom and Dad this, and I'm going to make a cake in your kitchen, which was on the other side of the wall because it was an attached house, semi-attached house. And we go in, and don't forget, my whole family is in cahoots with The Lie to keep it from me. My sister is lying, telling that my parents had a long time married, and never says that she's the child of a different man. Everybody's lying. The aunts, the uncles, they're all in on it. And 2 aunts and uncles are there. Everyone is singing happy, anniversary, happy 25th. My parents were married 11 years. It was absurd.
And there was one uncle that was like, that doesn't seem right. And they're like, come on.
It was like, Shah.
Yeah, Shah.
Shah.
And then, so, one thing I wonder, like, did they make up this story for themselves, or did they make it up for you?
No, they made it up for themselves.
Okay.
And I was too little for them to trust me with the truth. My sister's 14 years older than I. My sister lived through it.
Yeah.
She was taken on the run when she was 3 years old, away from the abusive guy. But she lived as the daughter of a single mother for 10 years after that. She knew her own life. I knew nothing. I got born into a lie, basically.
And how did you find out the story?
That's that was the. I mean, I've written so many times that scene because I can't seem to get it out of my system. What it feels to be lied to by your parents, and how it affected my whole life. Needing to develop trust, needing to peel the onion and make sure what appears is actually true. I think it made me both a journalist and a feminist. A journalist because that's what we do. We don't take the surface or the quote and just believe it. And a feminist because I saw the lies my mother had to cover up to be a perfect woman. The need to be a perfect woman and the power of that feminine ideal in those years.
And what do you think in 1950s, what was the perfect American Jewish woman?
Well, the perfect, I know exactly who she was. She was active in Hadassah and the National Council of Jewish Women. She took a bath at the end of the day and put on a clean, fresh house dress to make a dinner for her husband. Came home from work and there was a set hour to sit down. She prided herself on cutting recipes out of the Ladies' Home Journal and Good Housekeeping magazine. That became her American education, women's magazines. They taught her how to be an ideal woman. You had to applaud your husband's every triumph, even uplift him when there was no triumph, not contradict him. You had to make a beautiful house. You had to clean until everything was sparkling. I remember in the 60s there was a commercial on TV where you thought the woman was having an orgasm over her floor. She was like, she was like, look at the sheen and look at, and that's the way women were programmed.
Well, and
competitively.
There's something where your father is being honored by the Jamaica Jewish Center.
Right.
He had been president of the synagogue and went to all the meetings and everything. But in all of them, they talk about the wife who was selfless, like the wife who they're praising her for almost not existing, for giving over,
for letting Jack. My father's name was Jack. They praise Seal. And the lie is in that story. The lie that they met in college, which is a complete lie. They didn't meet in college. They met when they each were visiting their daughters in boarding school in 1935, I think. Anyway, when he got a testimonial dinner, what you're referring to is this little bio, not so little, 2-page bio, and in it says, and Seal, who lets the Jamaica Jewish Center steal her husband almost every night of the week. Well, that was the story of their marriage right there. That she had no life except, waiting for him at home.
But then that in the 1920s, she was a wonderful designer, and she worked for Hattie Carnegie.
She worked her way up to become a dress designer at Hattie Carnegie, which is like Liz Claiborne or something, or Donna Karan.
So she has this, again, she has to forge her own path in a number of ways. Forge her own path as a single mother, as a divorced mother, forge her own path in this career. And then that's the woman who then has to take on all of this
of the subservient roles of 1950s womanhood. Which is why I, observing them, said, I'm never doing that. It's all a reaction formation. It's a dialectic, right?
Well, and what I love too is that your book is still sensitive to your father's position. Clear. So, what were the pressures your father was under? So again, you're clear he's not sensitive to your mother.
Anything.
He's a little bit of a peacock, right? He has but what are the pressures he's under? What was the Jewish ideal?
That was the secret that probably surprised me. One of the secrets that surprised me most. One of my granddaughters was taking a biography class and asked if she could make me her subject. And she said, the only proviso is, Grandma, you cannot edit a word. Whatever I find out, I have to be free to put it in. I said, fine, Molly. She goes and she does all this incredible research on me. She reads all my stuff. She calls up all my old friends. I gave her numbers of friends so old there were no area codes on their phone numbers.
Let alone email.
She had to do a lot of digging to get my college friends, my friends from Ms. Magazine, childhood everything.
I wonder where she got that ability to search, to research,
Right.
to uncover. I don't know.
I don't know.
I don't know.
To peel the onion back, right? And she doesn't have lying parents.
So she was able to get the good. And
Right. So she's going through, she went to my archive, which is at Smith College, and she spent, I think, 2 or 3 days there. Then she says, I want to see everything in your study at home. So she comes in my study at home, and she says, where's the childhood stuff? And she opens a cabinet that's very deep, and she pulls out first my teenage diaries. I don't know if you had one by the time you came along, but all the women, the girls of my generation had little leather diaries with a lock and key. Okay, as if the CIA was coming to vet our lives, right, our teenage lives. And she opens, this is great, and she takes them and she's going to research them. She said, wait, where's other stuff from the childhood? I said, well, I threw everything into this deep cabinet. And so she goes down on her hands and knees, and I do too, and out comes this plastic shopping bag full of hundreds of letters. And I mean, it's pay dirt, as you know, as a historian, for a biographer, for a memoirist. In there are hundreds of letters my parents wrote to each other. When my father was traveling, the Peacock went to Palestine when my mother was 7 months pregnant, left her in the Bronx when I was just in utero. And they wrote every single day. Now, people are never going to have that resource because people are now
they don't write
emailing
letters.
LMK, I heart you.
IDK, yes.
You know, I mean, they're not getting this. It's so rich, and it's illuminating. Every letter is like lit up with story.
And to be able to have 2 of those, because often historians will find the letter someone received, but they don't have what was written, and to find that for ordinary people.
It's true. My father saved my mother's letters, and my mother saved my father's letters, and they're all in there. And it's amazing, because when you say my mother was secretly had competencies, I see that my mother was the political activist. She was aware that war was coming before my father. My father said, "Don't worry, wartime jitters are over," or something like that.
And this is 1930.
In 1939, when my father was traveling, to Palestine. My mother saw all the signs, and she was writing to her congressperson, her congressmen. My mother also, when my father was gone, managed this little 6-floor apartment house in the Bronx that my grandfather and my father owned together. And my mother was collecting rents and hiring painters. I mean, I never saw that woman. I never saw that.
And that's the woman of the tenements, right? That's the woman of the tenements
Yeah.
who's running the household, running the household economy, or running the store.
Right.
Not listed in the census, but doing
Exactly.
all of that work.
Who was
They
doing
had
all
that
this
know-how.
stuff here and making bread and washing things by hand. I don't know how. But my mother of the 1950s, which is the woman I knew, was deferring to her husband. He knows the best. It would emasculate him if she showed her competency. So it was so fascinating.
And
I saw the architecture of their marriage. I saw my father. You asked about my father. My father, I thought, always was wealthy because he had a nice car. He always a kind of snazzy dresser, He would pick up the check with another couple, and that was all show. The letters show my father was penny pinching to the point where when he was in Palestine and wanted to bring back mementos, he was keeping track of the price of every little wooden camel. He had like the sand from the Negev. He was saying, I can get this silk scarf better if I wait till the ship docks at Alexandria. I couldn't believe it. This man who had such a show of success, masculine Jewish success in the 1950s. That's what he was, the pretense of his life. And to see who he really was, I felt really sorry for him. I felt compassion for him, for all the things he had to hide.
So that part of being middle class was being the provider and being and
exactly.
that role. I mean, I think you sensitively show I mean, you don't spare words for the things that made you angry, but that was its own kind of anxiety, its own kind of pressure.
Absolutely.
that was playing
She
on,
was
on both of
pretending
them.
to be the ideal woman. He was pretending to be the ideal man for their class, for their social class, for the Jewish ambiance of their community.
And in the 1950s, you also have this interesting thing that kind of plays out through the way that you talk about some of the other relatives. First, one of your aunts, who was a communist, and also your mother-in-law.
My mother-in-law is a communist, and one of my aunts was a communist.
And so that doesn't quite fit in. So whereas socialism fit into the tenement milieu,
Yeah.
as you go into the next generation and you're moving into New Jersey or you're moving to Queens, that doesn't always fit, because when there is a crackdown on communism in the 1950s and a real fear of communism, that was very hard for some of these families. That was also something that would be considered a Shanda in some respects.
There were political Shandas. There was Shandas around illness. There were Shandas about unimaginable number of things that people had to hide, had to cover up. But they weren't going to give up on their values. They weren't going to give up on their dreams and their ideals. And so, as I said, I grew up next door to my aunt and uncle and their 3 children with a wall between us in a semi-attached house. Tiny house, 6 rooms, but they were the size of, each room was like this big. And this aunt was a member of the party. And she went down to Union Square, and she brought with her the proverbial milk box to stand on, and she gave pamphlets away, and she taught people who were working class people Marx and Engels. And they were very well educated, these organizers. My mother was a fellow traveler, but not, my mother was way too scared. So she would try to protect my aunt and get my aunt down off the high perch, because J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI would be coming. And in fact, J. Edgar Hoover was watching Jewish Housewives. That happens to be true, and we found all that out after the fact. So when I met my husband in 1963, and his mother was a communist, it was totally familiar to me. I knew the language, I knew the feeling, I knew the ideals, I knew the vocabulary.
And I think we have a photo of her.
Yeah, we
in
have
the
a
book we
photo
can
of
show
her
too, yeah.
selling cans and collecting cans in order to open a second front, in order for the Soviet Union and the U.S. to be more allies. Because there was a Hitler-Stalin pact that had to be undone, remember.
Did you ever hear your parents talking about, like, getting worried about that kind of activity? Okay, yeah.
And I mean, I knew what I had to shut up about. I knew the Shah, it's the Shanda part. And I was so tuned in that I write in the book about how my aunt turned me on to Howard Fast, who wrote these very novels about, they were couched in metaphors, but they were novels about socialism and about the perfectible systems of government that would allow for everyone to flourish. And one of those books was called Freedom Road, and one was called Spartacus. And I'm not sure which one I told about it in the book, but I don't remember which one. Each of them was in its own way. One was about slavery, and one was about the Roman period. And I wrote a book report, I think for the 6th grade, and my teacher kind of said, what made you read Freedom Road? This is when people were turning people in, their neighbors. And I got my antenna went up, because I knew from my household, from my family, watch out for people who will turn us in. We were very careful, and so I said, I just found it in the library, the Queensboro Public Library. My parents had nothing to do with it. I would never have told that my Aunt Tilly got me reading this book. She would be appalled. My mother would be terrified.
So there was so much, even as a child, that you understood
that
you had to avoid the Shanda. One thing I wondered about, and there's I think a lot about our visitors, and our visitors come, and they often have family secrets that they've learned.
Right.
And we talk often about, at what point do you tell your children about a family secret? And you have a beautiful quote, a beautiful paragraph talking about, if you had known what Jenny had done, if you'd known what your grandmother had done by taking those sheets together and going out the window and escaping, if instead of having been hidden, if that had been brought out and kind of burnished, that could have been an heirloom to pass on.
For not just myself, if I think all the women, all the girls in my family, in that same thesis of, if you can't see it, you can't be it. If we had seen that flicker of rebellion and had that story as part of our legacy, we would have, I think we would have felt a little more comfortable about being non-conventional. I was not breaking any rules when I was growing up.
And
I was, because I had to, I had no idea that there was a transgressive rebel.
But then that gave you, that gave you, in some ways, the perch to do the work that you did with Ms. Magazine, but it was there, the story, because you learned by that point. You learned the story.
In retrospect, I say, I come from that. I must come from that. That I didn't even know. My little old grandma. I don't know if you ever showed that picture of the family, but she's sitting there, and I call her a unibosom, because you can't see anything between the hair and her stomach. It's all one profile. And I see her like that, and I see her as so sort of impenetrable. She was a Yiddish-speaking siphon. I didn't know her.
And then the next generation, your mother also took control of her own life with what was given to her. Given all of those, I think given all of those expectations that she had to live around and the responsibilities she had, she took what was given to her and she tried to create something. And
she created a new narrative. As she went along, whether it was pretending that her uncle, her quote rich uncle, he was probably a middle class person, was her father, and this apartment in the Bronx was her place, or whether it was faking her high school picture, she created a narrative that fit who she felt she wanted to be.
And part of that is shame and Shanda, but I also wonder to what extent pride is part of it. Was there like a pride in who she wanted?
What she could be, that she could pass. It's so similar to blacks passing who have light skin. There's a shame in doing it and leaving your own, but there's also, I can pass, And she could fake it. She could fake, she became an autodidact. She went to evening school. She read constantly. She went and learned Hebrew, and she didn't want my father to zoom past her, so she did catch up. And she certainly wanted me to, but she didn't want me to go far from home. There was a part of her that was still afraid of the world.
Well, you've done such a wonderful job in exploring and unearthing all of these secrets and that work, and I think fashioning not just a path for yourself and your family, but for so many others through the writing. One thing I know people have asked, I got a question from a viewer who wanted me to ask the question, because when you're sharing the Shandas, there's so many people involved, and I know you spoke to so many people to get permission, but what advice do you have to give to families who want to expose the Shandas because of the therapeutic elements of it, but yet how do you straddle that line between what is yours to tell and what is not?
Well, none of my mother's or father's siblings were alive, nor their spouses, so I didn't have to worry about that. But I went to all my cousins who are living, who I wanted to get permission from, and the remarkable thing is they said, well, you don't know about the other thing. And they would suddenly add to the secret.
So go ask for advice, because you'll find out more.
Yes. And then I realized that all the things that my parents and my sister and I even felt were Shanda's, once they were on the page, they was ridiculous. Ridiculous. I tell about my Aunt Joan, who pretended to be barren, because it was a Shanda to not want to
have children. I love that story.
So she had to pretend to be barren And when in 1968, when we were at a Seder, and I came with my son David in a little carry-all box, and he was stuck to the side because nobody wanted her to be near babies. It would hurt her feelings. She couldn't have children. We were supposed to protect her from our children, and we were all so productive. I mean, so fecund, reproductive, and and then we're sitting together with a chocolate-covered matzah. I remember it so well. And she keeps asking me about David and about my twins, who were 3. Oh, the twins, they must be so upset. Suddenly there's competition for them, and how and he's so cute. And I keep saying, isn't this chocolate really good? Barton's never used to make good chocolate covered matzah. And I'm just
now I want some.
Trying to keep her off talking about children because I was raised to feel so sorry for her.
Shanda, yes.
And then she says, Letty, stop doing that. I had 2 abortions. We didn't want children. But in this family, you couldn't not want children. It was our job to replenish our people after the Holocaust. It was so simple when you hear it, but now it's so ridiculous, But there still are people who don't want children, and their community makes them feel they have to be mothers.
I know we are in a room that's a tenement room where we've been able to summon up the generations past and connect, Harris and Jenny Levine's story maybe to Nathan and Jenny's story, Nathan and Jenny Halpern. But we also have in the room your grandchildren.
Right.
And I'm wondering if they have questions that they would like to ask.
Yeah, I am so thrilled. I have
and then we'll
2
go to
of
the
my
chat.
grandchildren here, Maya Claris, the daughter of my daughter Robin, and Ben Shapiro, the son of my daughter Abigail, who are twins. So whatever.
Call me Benjamin, it's fine. I've got a couple running through the old brain. First of all,
so just start with 1.
Okay, I'm going to go with 1 for now.
Yeah.
Why don't you go ahead and start,
No,
since
yeah,
you
go
seem
on.
to be more adamant. I guess... Oh, yeah, for sure.
We're just waiting for a microphone for young
Benjamin.
Benjamin Shapiro.
Thank you so much.
Turn it on?
It's on.
It's on. Great. You talked a lot about, how these gender roles are sort of imbued and learned from a very young age. And you sort of did the almost miraculous thing of unlearning these historic gender roles, and then sort of provided the gift of publishing editorials to help other people on that journey. And I'm curious as to, could you identify almost a turning point where you almost stepped back from the Shonda world and saw that, there's a different way to live, and therefore I will do it that way?
Yes, there was my big turning point was when I was very well educated Jewishly, for a girl, for my era. I was one of the first girls to ever be bat mitzvah in conservative Judaism. Reform Judaism was a little ahead. And I went to Hebrew school from age 3 until I graduated from Hebrew high school, and I also had 2 years at the Yeshiva of Central Queens. So for a girl, that's a lot of Jewish education. But when my mother died, and I was 15 years old, I was not allowed to count in the minyan, the quorum of 10. That's required for public prayer, and to say the Kaddish, the memorial prayer. And my father had made many exceptions for himself from the restrictions of halakha, Jewish law. He smoked on Shabbat when you couldn't, and he drove on Shabbat to shul when you weren't supposed to. But he wouldn't make an exception for me. Why? Because if he authorized me, he was the arbiter of Judaism in my life, and he was very knowledgeable. He was a Torah reader, and he was a Torah and Talmud teacher, and he was a Hebrew teacher, and he did tutorials for bar mitzvah boys. He was the authority. And he could break rules for himself, but he couldn't break a rule for me in the presence
in a public
of
setting.
the house full of Jews, including, there were 9 men, and the rest were women in our living room at that moment. And my father picked up the phone and called the shul and said, would you send a 10th man?
Who was a stranger.
A stranger who didn't know even how to say the Kaddish, which is something most Jews learn by the time that they're grown up. So it was just so unconscionable that I counted myself out, and I just dropped out of formal Judaism for the next 15 years, and that's when I found feminism, which became my religion. And because there's no surprise, the move from Judaism to feminism is easy because they're justice-bound, principles.
Well,
on both
and
sides.
I think in this country, there's an historical experience of women doing things and wanting to then translate that into that realm.
And it's no surprise that many leaders of feminism, many of them unrecognized, but I know about them, were Jews, because we learned to liberate. That's what we learn at our Seder table. We learn to liberate the oppressed, and that we're supposed to imitate what God did, what Moses did in our lives. And so for me, that really, it became an evolutionary turning point for me to see that I needed to reform my own co-religionists. I needed to bring my feminism into Judaism. And I spent a lot of years doing that.
Thanks, Grandma.
You're welcome, Ben. Maya?
Absolutely.
Okay. My question is, I guess, you're digging into the past, and I'm thinking about the fact that, obviously we're in a different time, but we're in the information age. I mean, it is so much easier to meet somebody and go online and find out so much about them, and we're taking DNA tests to find out who our parents are, if we're adopted. I'm not adopted, but people are really able to know much more.
Right.
Than they were when, your grandmother or your mother or you were growing up. A lot of the mystery of a person and figuring out something about their life is gone. I'm curious what you think about that, if you think it's a good thing, if you think it's actually helped anyone move past their family's ails, or
I think that this period, this era of hyper-sharing would pass for a secret-free phenomenon, but it isn't. People just have different secrets. You don't have, sexuality isn't a secret for most people. If you're an addict, you go for help, and you organize in order to get services. If things are out that would have ruined a family in my parents' and grandparents' generation. But I think that what's secret now has the capacity, if exposed, to have the same impact as the Shanda, to ruin you, and that's called cancel culture. What I call the Shanda is cancel culture. It ruined you. It ruins you. It can lose you your friends. It can lose you your job. It can lose you your reputation. It can lose you your book contract. And I mean, all of those are real life examples that I've cited. And that's what the Shanda could do. The Shanda could ruin you. It could make it impossible for you to either find a match or find a match for your children to marry. It could make your household seem to be touched by bad luck. That was a big thing. You don't want to marry into that family. There's a lot of cancer in that family, that kind of thing. So even though it looks as though you can find out anything, there are still things that people hide now, and still things they're ashamed of. And my ideal world would be a secret-free world for each of us, because the burden of a secret is a killer. I learned through my friend Alan Aldo, who I've known since Free to Be You and Me, because I was an editorial consultant and he was a performer and a director of some of the episodes in it. He went on television to admit he had Parkinson's disease because he wanted to control the narrative. He didn't want the gossip columnists to do it. And if it was known he had Parkinson's, he was afraid he wouldn't be cast in movies, or he wouldn't be able to write or direct, or or people would think he was on his way to death. So he made very clear what his disease was like and what he was doing to work against it.
Yeah, and the importance of feeling comfortable sharing opinions in a world in which we have a community where we can accept a range of opinions and have conversations and all of that. That is the hope. Are there any questions from? We're good? Okay, excellent. Well, Thank you so much. The time has flown by. I highly recommend this book. You can get it from the Tenement Museum. I think it's on a link if you're watching
good.
online.
Good.
It is
Oh,
wonderful.
I
It's a
probably
page
should
turner.
tell a story that I told myself I should tell because it's so vivid. And my mother did tell this story many times about how she and her sister Tilly, who ended up next to her, shared a very narrow bed. It sounded like a cot. It just was a thin mattress with springs, the way she described it. And they were near a window, and the window was into an air shaft. And every now and then, the boy who lived upstairs would pee.
Yep.
And
We've heard this.
you've
I mean,
heard
not
this?
from there, not from Seal and from Tilly.
Yeah,
but yes,
so tell
yes.
me, you mean you've heard this exact story?
Well, because the air shafts, which were mandated in order to bring more air and light into the tenements, didn't really do a great job. And people also, even if there were 2 toilets per floor, there would be a line for them. And so people
How
then
many people
used
per
that.
toilet?
It depended on the year, but like 1900, there's about 111 people in the tenement, so that's about 20 per floor, 25 per floor, so sharing 2 toilets.
That's why they had to pee, and the guys just took advantage of their physiology and did it out the window.
Exactly, yet another thing.
So I wanted just to pass that along
Yes.
because it's such a vivid image
That's it,
to
yeah.
me, and how they would sometimes take their pillows and sleep on the fire escape in the summertime.
Absolutely. I mean, just thinking about the way that these tenement structures were the settings in which everyone had to kind of live out their new American lives or their new New York lives if they were moving here from a different place. So thank you so much for
you.
this book, for this conversation.
Thank you, Annie.
And thank you for
I love
tuning
this
in.
museum so much.
Well,
We celebrated our 35th wedding anniversary here. We brought our family here. Our girls were pregnant at the time.
And you're supposed to do your Passover, maybe next year, the Passover Seder here,
Yeah,
too.
that would
That's
be
excellent.
fabulous.
Well, we hope we celebrate many more
Thank
simchas
you. Thank
with
you.
your family.
Thank you.
And for all of you, thank you so much for tuning in. And we have another Tenement Talk Wednesday about education. Thursday. But Wednesday or Tuesday or any day you want, I encourage you to go online and watch our gala, which was live streamed last Tuesday. We have a great interview with Lonnie Bunch, Secretary of the Smithsonian, and it's a great way to find out more about the Tenement Museum. And of course, please, please, please come visit. And if you like, become a member, support the museum. These are all free, so we'd love to keep doing them for free. So please support us if you can, and have a wonderful evening. And please join me in thanking Letty Cottin Pogrebin.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Annie.